Really, thank you so much. We are so honored to be here as part of this conference, and it's so exciting to see the growing momentum of the space of data literacy right now coming from all different areas. So what we're going to talk about today, that was brought up in the morning session as well, is this idea around empowerment. How do we actually talk about empowerment given that data is a space of inequality, where there are haves and there are have-nots? And so as Charles says, my name is Catherine Dignazio. I am a professor of data visualization and civic media at Emerson College. I also work with I'm a principal investigator at the Engagement Lab, which is an applied research lab at the intersection of technology and civic life. And I'm a research affiliate at the MIT Center for Civic Media, where Rahul is based.
My name is Rahul Bhargava, and I am a research scientist at the Center for Civic Media at the MIT Media Lab. And I do teaching there, I do research there primarily around data literacy. I've been running workshops for maybe 10 years now with a variety of audiences, from nonprofits to educators to students to journalists to government to businesses. So I like helping people build their capacity to do empowering work to create change with data in the communities that they live in.
So the problem that we're going to talk about today is around data and inequality. And so I want to bring us back to this amazing quote from the science fiction writer William Gibson, author of Neuromancer. So he said a long time ago, the future is already here. It's just not very evenly distributed. And so this is the idea with data. There are emerging critiques of our new sort of knowledge revolution, as we were talking about earlier this morning, that point out that who is collecting and storing and analyzing data is very different from the people who are collected, the people whose information is stored, and the people who are doing the analyzing. So the reality in the space of data is that mostly who has the resources to collect and store and maintain large data sets are state and corporate actors. And they are also the people who have the technical know-how and the experts on hand to be able to draw out meaning and wisdom and intelligence from that data. And so there's a lot of emerging work in this space. Boyd and Crawford have talked about exactly this language of haves and have-nots. Folks like Mark Andreevich have talked about a big data divide. And as we saw earlier, there's also this emerging book specifically on inequality from Cathy O'Neill. So there's a lot of critiques in this space. Like, what exactly is it that makes this imbalance of data in the space? And it breaks down to 4 things. There's a kind of lack of transparency. So as our interactions with the world become datafied, as we're datafying, the steps that we take. So there's a couple of core critiques of inequality, and these break down to these 4 things. So the first is the lack of transparency. As more of our interactions with the world get turned into data, so even things as trivial as the steps that we take every day turn into data points, it's unclear who's collecting that data, when they're collecting it, and why. Data collection can often be extractive. So it's collected often by third parties. That's sort of what you see here is a little image of the third-party players in the space of data reselling. And it's not necessarily even meant for observation by the people whose data it is. This is a space of technological complexity. So it's very difficult, often, especially when the data sets get large, to understand what kinds of analysis techniques are being used, by whom, and how that's working. And then there's issues around control of impact, particularly when you talk about data that is collected for one reason, but then used for other reasons, such as to inform your credit score, or determine your promotion at work, or to determine your salary.
And this isn't necessarily new arguments. As Catherine's mentioned, there's a long history of these inequalities being exacerbated. We heard Emmanuel talk about it earlier with Data Pop Alliance work, but it's leaking into the popular press. You see a wonderful article by our friend Kate Trafford writing about what she called artificial intelligence white guy problem. So this idea that the stuff that's happening on the forefront, this data being generated now to be a seed and input into artificial intelligence algorithm, is actually incredibly biased data that's being created by a group of people that are, mostly white males sitting in Silicon Valley. And this is a serious problem that's causing and exacerbating inequality in a variety of dimensions and creating new dimensions of inequality. A specific example that just brings it home and is very concrete is this one that you might have seen, where these web cameras that were being sold were doing facial tracking. So as you moved, they could recenter, and it worked on white faces, and it didn't work on darker-skinned faces. And that's, kind of terrible that they didn't even test that and catch it. What's far worse is that example is 6 years old, and we still have that problem in the algorithms that do this. So my good colleague Joy, who is a student now at the Media Lab, writes about what she calls the coded gaze. And she calls it that because as she's developing vision software that uses algorithms to track a face, she is an African American, and she has to wear a white mask to get it to work right on her. This is incredible, right? This is like one of many embarrassing things that as someone that was trained as a computer scientist, I have to deal with in the field that I work in. And this is what's happening in the algorithms that are being addressed now. It's not just sort of high idea, it's like personally impactful things. And this is a silly one. I'm not even talking about predictive policing or other things. So we want to think for a minute about this concept of empowerment in data, right? So how do we think about how data and the approaches around it can actively empower or disempower you, as Emmanuel talked about in terms of the history of literacy actually being something that is actively disempowering? We've been talking at you a lot all morning, so we decided to just take some time and let you talk to each other. So we're going to take 5 minutes, and I want you to think about these two questions. When you think about this framing of a gap between those that are sort of empowered with data and those that are not, do you see examples of these small problems that we're starting to talk about and that you heard this morning? And what does empowerment mean to you in the work that you're doing? So first, just to give you what that means to us, what we think about when we think about empowerment in data, we tend to think about you and your community. So it's individual and it's at a community level. So those two can actually work with data. Second piece of empowerment in data is you and your community using data to actually make arguments, right? So you're putting together that data into a story that you're trying to tell and trying to make an argument with. And the third piece is that those arguments that you're making and the stories that you're telling can actually create change. Right? So this is the sort of the end result of empowerment, that you can use that data, argue with it, and create change.
So you might notice here that being able to actually do these things involves more than just technical skills. And so that's something that I think Emmanuel was alluding to this morning when we're talking about what makes for actual literacy. If we're talking about literacy for empowerment, it's not just about knowing how to use R. Because you can have some great data, but knowing how to actually use that to make arguments, knowing how to actually use that to change things implies a host of other skill sets in a connected context. And so the goal here of this work is not to create more data readers, right? We've been talking a lot about what is the definition of data literacy. It's not creating people who are just good at understanding a bar chart, though understanding a bar chart is good. I'm glad people are learning how to do that. But it's actually also about creating more writers, creating more people who are able to collect their own data, critically speaking, to be able to analyze that data, to be able to make meaning from that data, to tell stories with that data. So it's about creating data writers or data speakers. So how do we get to the point where we can start to bridge some of the inequality in this space? And here, I'll turn it.
Sure. So we try to break this down on two dimensions in terms of audiences, and we're going to give examples of both. One, on the right there, is taking people that are typically disempowered and helping them learn to speak data, to do these things, work with data, argue with data to create change. And we're going to use the people icon to represent that. On the other side, we're talking about the people that are actually in power already, right? The institutions that have the data and are making decisions with the data, helping them speak well with data to talk in appropriate ways to the audiences they're engaging with, either clients or populations or citizens. So we want to give examples of both of these. Just to give some background on each of those, when we mean speaking well, when we're talking about the institutions, we look to Seymour Papert, the amazing educator that just passed away, certainly inspiration in my life, who looked at the computer in the late 60s and saw this programming interface and realized that that was not an appropriate way to speak, to help children get engaged with this powerful tool. So he went about designing this amazing robotic turtle with a pen on the back, so that you could have this physical thing that children could engage with, and they could program the turtle as a way to program to think. And that's the kind of thing we mean when we mean speaking well, so translating in appropriate ways for an audience. On the flip side, learning to speak, we looked for inspiration to activists and amazing philosophers like Paulo Freire, who argued with his popular education that the goal of literacy was actually to be empowering. And he played out in a couple of ways in terms of trying to empower citizens he worked with throughout Brazil in the early years. But him trying to create a definition of literacy that was about empowerment. So those are the sort of philosophical inspirations that we look to.
So we think this distinguishing is important, is that data literacy is not just about creating an ability to kind of speak data for those who are not yet in our cult, so to speak, but it's also about helping those with power who do have data, who do have technology and resources, helping them communicate better, communicate more ethically, and make decisions in slightly different ways even. So to that extent, we have 3 examples that we want to show that we think will help communicate these ideas around what it means to speak well with data and what it means to learn how to speak with data. So in particular, like the speaking well involving the people who have data, the data haves, learning how to communicate better what they are doing to public audiences and potentially solicit their feedback in new and different ways. And then the people who are learning to speak, the people who are non-technical fields, learning how to collect, analyze, and make meaning from data. So the first example we want to talk about is this idea of what data do we learn with? And this, again, was also talked about widely this morning, which we're really pleased about, because the basic idea here is that sample data matters. What data you are using to teach people matters deeply. So how many people in the audience have heard of the software program R? R is a statistical software programming package. Okay, so a good amount of people. So if you have heard of or used R or tried to learn R, you may have come across this data set, which is the MT-CARS data set. This is a widely used data set in many, many examples of teaching with R. And so this is an example of what not to do, actually. How many of you in the audience are also car mechanics or car experts? 0. It's like pausing for translation just in case. But so the idea here is like, who actually has deep context? This is a data set that is about like miles per gallon that different car brands get versus displacement. It also has other parameters like cylinders that a car has and horsepower and how these things affect performance. And so the interesting thing here is, I find this example, I'm not really a car person. These kind of examples are completely alienating if your audience is not either car salespeople or mechanics, right? So that's one point. So that's a good example of like what not to do.
This is a problem with the tools that we use as well. So 2 examples. One is d3.js, which is this library for transforming web pages into data-driven documents, and Tableau, which is a tool for visualizing and finding stories. They have all these amazing visual examples when you hit their home pages or their product pages. And those are great, and it's great that they can do that. But there's little discussion on whether those fancy sort of high literacy examples are effective ways to communicate to audiences. So you end up with things like a community meeting in the US, just to tell a personal example, where people are showing fancy animations over time along 3 dimensions generated by Tableau, which nobody in the audience knows how to read. right? This is like nobody in the audience understood the visual that was being presented. So these examples are actually really targeted towards that high literacy end. So it's not helping those that are in power learn to speak well to audiences that might not have that level of data literacy. One example on the other side, with the people learning to speak, is a suite of tools that Charles mentioned that we've been working on called databasic.io. And they introduce some simple concepts. We'll talk more about them and do some of the hands-on activities in our workshop later. But we baked in sample data that is more culturally relevant. So in English, you get things like Hillary Clinton speeches or lyrics from popular music artists. But then if you flip the tool into Spanish, we support English, Spanish, and Portuguese. If you flip it into Spanish, you end up with a top picture. So lyrics from musicians from like Shakira or speeches from Fidel Castro, things that might be more resonant, right? Simple examples.
And a final, very compelling example of this idea of using like appropriate contextual sample data is this amazing project, Local Lotto, which happened in 2013, a collaboration between MIT, Brooklyn College, and CUP, an organization in New York. And so this is a project that used the theme of the state lottery to teach mathematical concepts in data analysis and probability to urban high school students in New York City with no prior background in data. They're high school students. And so they combined qualitative data about the lottery in their neighborhoods, which they collected by actually doing interviews with people, again, in their neighborhood, and then looking at quantitative data around lottery ticket buyers. And so with a combination of quantitative and qualitative analysis, they had to then make the argument for whether the lottery was a good thing or a bad thing for their neighborhood. So it's focused on a kind of goal. We need to find out, this is an inquiry-driven question, we need to know whether the lottery is a good or bad thing for us, because it's about us and it's about our community. So if you think about the combination of quantitative and qualitative, but also the deep contextual knowledge that these students are bringing to their everyday environment, the environment that they walk through every day. This is not an abstract, random data set about cars or something that's very distant from their lives. This is the everyday neighborhood that they walk through. So the second example that we want to talk about is this idea of how data can function to bring people together. And so something that is often overlooked is that data can actually be a great way to start a conversation amongst diverse stakeholders in a space who care about a particular public issue. I love this great quote from Denise Ross, where she was framing open data as a kind of potential community campfire. This is a space of gathering where we come together, people that may not otherwise be talking to each other, and we try to figure out what's happening. We try to figure out what is the meaning here. So it can be used to stage conversations and then also think about what emerges, what kind of collective decision-making emerges from that process. So a really interesting example of, again, a kind of more institutional space doing this well, and this example of speaking well, there was a public transportation planning process in Boston, and they did a kind of very unprecedented public engagement process in the formation of a transportation master plan for the city, where they said, okay, instead of just doing civic participation by like hosting a couple of town meetings at 8 p.m. when everybody is tired and putting their kids to bed, we are going to actually go out and have all of these different ways, online and offline, that we are collecting citizen ideas for the future of transportation in Boston. They collectively collected more than 6,000 of those ideas. So they amassed a large data set, a large qualitative data set, because these are all ideas for the future. But the interesting thing is they didn't stop there. They didn't just like take that data set and then hand it over to, a social science researcher and say, okay, figure this out. They actually made the data analysis process, again, another opportunity for community dialogue. So they staged these community events where 70 plus community leaders and representatives came together around small tables, and these were data analysis events. Each table had a certain part of the data that they were responsible for, and they were responsible for prioritizing and highlighting the most important ideas from that process. And this can extend into the speculative realm as well. So as a way of inviting a community to elaborate a collective vision of the future. So in this project, which is a little bit more coming from the art and sort of speculative design realm, the Institute for Infinitely Small Things, what we did is we engaged the residents of Cambridge, Massachusetts in conversations about the names of public places in their cities, noting that the names were often very exclusive, very affiliated to Harvard. And in this project, we were very inspired by the model of Wikipedia, of OpenStreetMap, and this idea of like, how could we turn the city into a read-write endeavor? What would you rename public places to if you were responsible for naming public places? And so here we staged, for 2 years, we staged renaming parties, and people came in and they proposed new names for public places in Cambridge, which ultimately led to the production of a map, which we called the map formerly known as the City of Cambridge.
So another example in terms of empowering people that otherwise don't speak data, speak the language of data. I do these activities called data sculptures. So I have a simple data handout, maybe a bar chart and one pie chart or one table on a piece of paper about some topic. And I have a table full of craft materials. So things like pieces of wood, tape, pipe cleaners, little pom-poms or styrofoam balls, things that you'd see in a kindergarten classroom. And then I give people that come to the workshop 6 minutes to look at that data and build something physical that actually tells a story. And I do this for a number of reasons. One, it's fun. And when was the last time anyone heard a spreadsheet called fun? So I get out of that language. 2, I do it because even in that tiny example, you can respond to all the things that are created and talk about how you can find multiple stories in one data set. You can talk about how you can tell one story in different ways. You can talk about how sometimes you want to talk about the impact of the data if you want to explain something, or you can talk about the data itself if you want to help people explore something. You end up with a variety of things you can talk about in this little playground of an activity. And it's one of the ways we use arts to invite people in and here learn to speak data in a larger way. So the third example we want to dig some concrete stories into is the idea of presenting data appropriately. And this is where we get into some of these questions of that we have such a focus on visualization with a capital V, and fancy pictures created by a bunch of software. But there's actually this whole library of techniques for communicating data stories that's being missed when we do that. And I like to emphasize that a ton. And so Kelly Dobson, a colleague and friend of ours, talks about one of those is data visualization. So making that data physical, as those data sculptures do. So the first example I want to give is another arts one, and it's around helping institutions learn to speak well. So this is an example that is one of the data murals that we've created. So for maybe 6 years, my wife, who is an artist and a facilitator, and I have been creating these murals around the world. And so what's a data mural? The idea is that we can bring together the institutions in power. So in this case, it was the government that had a bunch of data. Learners, so this was at a school that was a creative school, and data that's about their context and around them, and facilitate one workshop where we help them turn that data into a story they want to tell, and then another workshop where we turn that story into a collaborative visual design that we paint as a mural. So this is a mural at the entryway to their school that tells a story about the changes that occur in their school while they're there for 4 years, totally driven by the qualitative and quantitative data that they generated about their experiences. A second example, on the other side, of helping people learn to speak is this lovely example from the mid-1800s. Usually when you talk about the history of data work, you see examples from Tufte and things like that with people like Playfair and Menard and all these old white guys that created charts in the early and mid-late 1800s. This was an amazing educator, Elizabeth Peabody, who created a giant quilt visualization that she rolled up and took on a train across the United States and rolled out and had people gather around and talk about her visualization of the history, where each box is a year and each color is some kind of event that happened, a war or something like that. This is the kind of inspiration that we look to for bringing people together and speaking appropriately, right? Rolling out a quilt in the mid-1800s is a totally normal activity to get people engaged. It's a language people understand.
And then a final example in the space, again, a little bit more from the art realm, is experimenting with new ways of doing public storytelling around data. So this is an example that was a collaboration between myself and my colleague, Andy Sutton, who is also an artist. And in this case, what we did is we created what we called a walking data visualization. So one of the things that's kind of interesting about the city of Boston is that a lot of the land in Boston is human-made, right? All of this land that's sort of in blue here has been filled in by people. So they actively created these parts of the city. So the interesting thing in light of what's happening with climate change is that these areas are actually also the most vulnerable to the rising seas of climate change. So the map of what Boston should look like, the predictive model for the year 2100 looks very similar to 1630. And so to sort of drive this home, I mean, we made a picture, but to sort of bring this down to a level where we can visceralize it, where we actually feel what this means, we felt like this was an opportunity to actually use our body to trace that coastline. And so we staged a public event. We had maybe around 40 people who came to participate, and we walked that sort of old and new or future coastline of the city of Boston, and along the way had lectures from the folks who are, for example, in city government, who are working on climate change adaptation, from folks from the Boston Harbor Association, who are doing a lot of the most cutting-edge research around Boston, the effects of climate change on the city of Boston, and as a sort of way of how do we create a teaching moment as a public event that involves data. I mean, climate change is one of those areas where it's very data heavy, but often in a very alienating way for the public. So hopefully these examples have given you some inspirations and sparks for how you might think about creating data literacy in different contexts and for different audiences. And so just to remind you of sort of what we went over, we're talking about bridging that gap, so bridging the gap between the haves and the have-nots, and folks on both sides of that gap have work to do, right? So we need to help institutions who have the data and might have the know-how to speak well with data, to actually be able to communicate it out in a transparent and ethical way, and helping the people who are the have-nots, which are probably most of us, learning how to be introduced to those concepts, but not in a way that's just about reproducing the status quo, but that's actually about empowering people to reframe questions and ask these kind of institutions, like, where's the data that actually matters to us? And so we showed examples about sample data, how we can think about data for bringing people together, and how we think about how we can be more expansive about forms for presenting data appropriately to different audiences.
So thank you very much. If you want to do some more of this discussion, please join us after this session in room 102. We'll be doing a workshop where we get into some of those arts-based, hands-on, fun activities.
Okay.